Jamal's backpack slipped from his shoulder as he stepped into room 214, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like a swarm of bees. The classroom smelled faintly of chalk and disinfectant, sterile and cold. Mrs. Carrington, the history teacher, flicked her sharp eyes toward him, and for a heartbeat, Jamal felt the air constrict. "Sit where I tell you," she snapped, her words slicing through the murmurs of the other students. Jamal's stomach knotted, a familiar tension settling into his chest. He obeyed, sliding into the seat nearest the back, where the sunlight barely reached. A pencil rolled off the desk, and he bent down to pick it up. That's when he heard it, a whisper loud enough for him to freeze. "Don't you belong somewhere else?" His face burned. He looked up at Mrs. Carrington, but she was already scribbling on the board, pretending nothing had happened. The murmurs of the class rose like a tide against him, casual cruelty hiding behind polite smiles. Jamal's fingers trembled, his heart hammering, but he refused to move. He could feel the weight of all the eyes, all the subtle judgments, and the silent permission that let them linger. In that instant, he knew this wasn't about grades or history. It was about survival, and someone would make sure he learned that lesson the hard way. Then the phone buzzed on the teacher's desk, a shrill, urgent tone that cut the room in two. Mrs. Carrington picked it up, her eyes narrowing at him just before she spoke. "I don't have time for your excuses today, Jamal." He swallowed, trapped in the glare, as a chill ran down his spine. Something was about to happen, and he wasn't ready. The fluorescent lights flickered as Jamal stepped into room 214, backpack heavy with notebooks and a sense of unease. Mrs. Carrington's eyes found him the moment he crossed the threshold, sharp as knives, and Jamal froze. Every new student feared her, but for Jamal, the fear carried an extra weight. "Sit where I tell you," she commanded. The words didn't invite compliance, they demanded it. He slid into the back row, where the sunlight barely touched the floor, the shadows wrapping around him like a cold embrace. A pencil rolled off his desk. Jamal bent down, and that's when the whisper hit him. "Don't you belong somewhere else?" He froze, cheeks burning, but the classroom's murmur swallowed the insult. Mrs. Carrington never looked up. "Jamal, focus," she snapped. "You'll never pass this class if you keep daydreaming." He opened his notebook, hands trembling, trying to make his pen move. Each scratch of graphite sounded impossibly loud. The words from the whisper clung to him, invasive and unwelcome. He glanced at his classmates. Some avoided his gaze, others smirked discreetly. Silence was complicity, he realized. Later, during a group activity, Mrs. Carrington singled him out again. "You clearly don't understand the question," she said, pointing at his worksheet. "Maybe your peers can explain it to you, if they can manage to tolerate your perspective." The words stung, but Jamal held his tongue. He had learned long ago that arguing could make things worse. Still, he noted every glance, every tone, every subtle push meant to remind him that he didn't belong. When the bell finally rang, Jamal packed slowly, savoring the moment he could escape the glare. But as he stepped into the hallway, he saw a sticky note on his locker. "Go back to where you came from." His stomach lurched. The words were simple, cruel, permanent. He stuffed the note into his pocket, clenching his fists. At lunch, he sat alone, the cafeteria noisy and bright. Conversations swirled around him, but no one reached out. Jamal's mind raced. How could he survive this environment? Each day promised more encounters like this, and the thought tightened around his chest like a vice. As he finished his sandwich, a shadow fell over his table. He looked up. One of the few students who had smiled at him earlier now sneered. "Guess some people just can't handle this school," the student muttered. Jamal didn't respond. He felt the weight of the day pressing down, a storm gathering on the horizon. Survival wasn't optional, it was a necessity, and the first real battle had already begun. The next morning, Jamal arrived early, hoping the quiet before class might offer some peace. The hallways smelled of polished floors and cafeteria grease, a smell that always reminded him of routine and rules. But peace was impossible in this school. Not for him. He passed Mr. Thompson, the English teacher, who greeted the white students with a warm nod and a smile. When Jamal walked by, the nod was barely perceptible, a half-second hesitation, a subtle narrowing of the eyes that stung more than an overt insult. He had started noticing these patterns. Small gestures, microaggressions, and a quiet hierarchy that placed him outside the circle of belonging. In history class, the tension returned. Mrs. Carrington stood at the front, chalk in hand, reciting facts in a clipped tone. Jamal raised his hand to answer a question about the civil rights movement. She ignored him completely, calling on a white student instead. His stomach twisted. It wasn't the first time. Each slight had begun to feel like a carefully measured strategy, an invisible line drawn around him that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't cross. After class, he stayed behind, packing his notebook slowly, pretending to organize his desk. A faint rustle of papers alerted him. The student council representative, Claire, hovered at the door. "You're Jamal, right?" she asked softly. Her voice carried hesitation, almost fear. I noticed what happened yesterday. That was wrong." Jamal stiffened. Few people ever acknowledged it. Most preferred silence. "Thanks," he said cautiously. "But it's just school." "No," she said, shaking her head. "It's more than school. It's how she treats you, and probably others too. People just don't say anything." Her words struck a chord. It wasn't just one teacher, one day. It was a pattern, a system. Jamal remembered the whispers in the hallway, the notes on lockers, the cold stares. Every encounter felt scripted to remind him he didn't belong. At lunch, he sat alone again, notebook open. He began documenting the incidents. Who said what tone they used when it happened. Even a whisper could be evidence. It felt clinical, almost like preparing for battle, but he knew it was necessary. If no one acknowledged the system, it would never change. "Jamal." A voice pulled him from his thoughts. It was Marcus, a basketball teammate who usually ignored him. He offered a nod, hesitant, unsure if speaking was safe. "Don't let them get to you." Jamal shook his head. "It's not about me," he said quietly. "It's the whole system. They let it happen because it's easy. Everyone else just looks away." Marcus sighed and walked off. Jamal returned to his notes, his pen scratching against the page. Even allies like Marcus were afraid, trapped by the same invisible force. The more Jamal noticed, the clearer it became. This wasn't personal. It was structural, institutional. Later in math class, a white student whispered to another, loud enough for Jamal to hear. "She hates him. He's going to fail." Jamal's chest tightened. He raised his hand to answer a question, and again Mrs. Carrington ignored him. Another white student got credit for an answer Jamal had explained. After class, the whispers didn't stop. Maybe if he tried harder. "He just doesn't belong here." Each word was a sting, but the silence of the rest of the room was heavier. No one stopped it. No one confronted it. At home, Jamal's mother noticed the tension in his shoulders as he dropped his backpack. "Another rough day?" she asked, concerned. Jamal nodded, sinking into the couch. "It's the same thing every day," he said. "They think I don't belong. Every teacher, every student. It's a pattern. I can't even raise my hand without feeling watched." She frowned, brushing a hand over his hair. "You're stronger than they know, Jamal. Keep your head up. Don't let them take your voice." Her words gave him warmth, but also the bitter reminder that survival would be a constant, calculated effort. The world outside school had rules, but inside, the rules were unwritten, invisible, yet crushingly clear. The next day, Jamal noticed the pattern extended beyond teachers. The hall monitors rarely stopped the harassment, and the guidance counselor shrugged when he mentioned the sticky note. "Kids will be kids," she said, her tone dismissive. Even the system itself seemed complicit. By the end of the week, Jamal's notebook was full. Incidents, dates, names, notes on tone and body language. He studied it like a strategist, trying to understand the battlefield he had been thrown into. One Friday afternoon, Mrs. Carrington called him to her desk under the pretense of reviewing his work. He approached cautiously, aware of the power she wielded. "Jamal," she said, leaning back, arms crossed. "I'm watching you. Step out of line and it will reflect poorly on your record. You need to understand your place here." Her eyes bored into him like she wanted to mark him permanently, to leave a scar invisible to everyone else. He nodded, calm on the outside, furious inside. As he walked back to his desk, he realized the truth. Survival meant knowing the patterns, predicting the traps, and never letting them see him falter. Every interaction, every word, every gesture was a test. And he couldn't fail. Not yet. The school day ended, the hallways emptied, but the weight lingered. Jamal pressed his notebook to his chest as he left, feeling both fear and determination. Patterns could be mapped. Patterns could be challenged. And he intended to do both, even if it broke him in the process. The first snow of the semester fell on Monday, covering the campus in a thin layer of white. Most students laughed and slipped through the icy sidewalks, but Jamal walked alone, headphones off, listening only to the crunch of his shoes. The snow softened the world, but it couldn't mask the tension that followed him everywhere. Class started in chemistry, and immediately, Jamal felt the weight of attention or the absence of it. His lab partner, a girl named Emily, barely nodded at him, whispering to the other students. Conversations stopped when he approached. Friends were few, and the silence of the others was deafening. Isolation wasn't just loneliness, it was a weapon. When Mr. Caldwell, the chemistry teacher, called students up to perform a demonstration, Jamal volunteered. His hands shook slightly, but he knew the material. As he stepped forward, Mr. Caldwell's gaze lingered, neutral in tone, but the other students' whispers cut like ice. "Careful," one of them muttered. "Don't mess it up." Jamal's hands didn't falter. He measured the chemicals carefully, mixed them according to instructions. The reaction worked perfectly, a small cloud of harmless smoke rising. A few students whispered in surprise, impressed, but the recognition never reached him. The teacher nodded once and returned to his desk. For Jamal, even a small success felt muted, swallowed by the atmosphere of expectation and scrutiny. During lunch, the cafeteria was a minefield. Groups huddled together, sharing jokes, trading stories, leaving Jamal to navigate tables with tentative steps. He found a quiet corner and pulled out his notebook, jotting down small victories and subtle slights. Notes became survival tools. Each observation, each whispered insult, each glance was a map he could use. Later, in English class, Jamal attempted to answer a question about symbolism in a novel. "Interesting," Mr. Thompson said, barely glancing at him. "But perhaps you should listen to your peers before offering your interpretation." The emphasis on the last words burned him. He clenched his notebook tighter, refusing to respond. By Wednesday, Jamal realized silence alone wouldn't shield him. Resistance, subtle as it needed to be, was essential. He corrected small errors teachers made on the board, cited passages from books when questioned, and raised his hand when questions were skipped over. Each act was a quiet rebellion. Sometimes it earned nods of surprise, sometimes angry glares. But each act reminded him that he was not invisible. At the library, Jamal met Claire again. She slid a note across the table. "You're not alone. Don't stop." Jamal's chest tightened. Even small connections mattered. They were reminders that some people noticed, that some people cared. Back in history, Mrs. Carrington unleashed her next attack. "I wonder if anyone else in this class shares your perspective, Jamal," she said, voice cold, eyes sharp. A few students snickered under their breath. Jamal took a deep breath, rising to meet her gaze without flinching. "Perspective is what allows us to learn history fully," he said quietly but firmly. "Ignoring certain voices doesn't make them disappear." Pause followed. The class held its breath. Mrs. Carrington's lips tightened, but she didn't respond. Jamal returned to his seat, heart pounding. It was a small victory, but in that silence, he realized power didn't always need to be loud. Outside, the wind had picked up. Jamal walked home, backpack heavier than ever. His mother noticed the tightness in his jaw. "You're carrying it all inside, aren't you?" she asked. "I have to," Jamal said. "I can't let them see that it hurts. I need to be ready for every day." The next morning, a new obstacle appeared. His locker had been decorated with derogatory stickers, an anonymous warning. Jamal stared at them, lips pressed together. He tore them down, careful to keep a record in his notebook. Every act of aggression became data, every attack a clue. By Friday, he had developed a routine: observe, document, survive, resist in small ways. Even minor resistance, correcting a teacher, standing tall in class, refusing to engage with whispered insults, felt revolutionary. And yet it was exhausting. Late that evening, he lay on his bed, notebook open, lights dim. His hand hovered over the pen, mind racing. Could one student really fight a system this entrenched? Could one voice ripple enough to make a difference? The question hovered, heavy in the air. Then he thought of the civil rights movement, the speeches, the marches, the ordinary people who had taken extraordinary risks. He felt a spark of resolve. Resistance wasn't a single moment. It was an accumulation of small, courageous acts. Survival meant endurance, but resistance meant reclaiming a space he was told he didn't belong in. Jamal's eyes closed. Tomorrow he would face the classroom again. He would stand, he would answer, he would resist. And he would not be invisible. By mid-October, the chill in the air mirrored the growing tension inside Jamal. Each day was a careful negotiation between survival and resistance, and he had learned to map the terrain. Which teachers tolerated his questions, which students whispered, and which corridors he could traverse safely. The first glimmer of hope came unexpectedly in the library. Miss Harper, the school librarian, glanced up from her desk as Jamal returned a book. "Jamal, right?" she asked. Her voice was soft but firm, the kind that invited trust. "I noticed the way Mrs. Carrington treated you yesterday." He blinked, unsure how to respond. Most adults either ignored the microaggressions or dismissed them. "I'm okay," he said cautiously. "No," she said gently. "You're not. And I want you to know, if you ever need someone to back you up or even just to talk, I'm here. I see what's happening." Her acknowledgement felt like sunlight after days of gray clouds. For the first time, Jamal realized he wasn't entirely alone. Small alliances mattered. They offered protection, support, and sometimes a lifeline. Later that week, Jamal approached Claire, the student council member who had whispered encouragement before. Together, they began brainstorming ways to document injustices more systematically. Claire was nervous, frequently glancing over her shoulder, but she was committed. "People need to see this," she said. "If we do it right, it can't be ignored." Jamal nodded, grateful but cautious. Allies were valuable, but trust came with risk. One wrong move could turn support into betrayal. And betrayal came sooner than he expected. It happened during chemistry. Jamal had worked on a lab project for days, meticulously recording results, making sure every step was precise. When he presented his findings, another student, a boy named Dylan, casually claimed the work as his own in front of Mr. Caldwell. The teacher, distracted and inattentive, nodded in approval, and the class erupted in murmurs of admiration for Dylan. Jamal's chest tightened. "That's my work," he said, voice low but steady. "I did all the calculations." Dylan shrugged, smirking. "Relax. Just a lab report. Don't take it so seriously." Mr. Caldwell barely looked up. "Good job, Dylan," he said, moving on. Jamal's hands clenched into fists. The betrayal cut deeper because it wasn't just Dylan. It was the system enabling him. Authority validated the theft, erasing Jamal's effort. After class, Jamal sat alone, trying to control the rush of anger. The cafeteria offered no refuge. Whispers followed him like shadows. Claire found him there, notebook in hand. "Are you okay?" she asked. Her eyes were wide, anxious. "I will be," Jamal said, forcing calm. "But I can't rely on people. Not yet. I have to protect myself first." Still, not all alliances failed. Miss Harper encouraged him to document everything, even the small betrayals, noting names, dates, and context. "You can't control others," she said. "But you can control the record. And one day, that record will matter." Back in history, Mrs. Carrington noticed his growing quiet defiance. "I hope you understand, Jamal," she said, voice low, almost venomous. "The world doesn't reward stubbornness in people like you." Jamal didn't flinch. Instead, he allowed the words to harden his resolve. Allies and enemies existed side by side, sometimes indistinguishable. And he would have to learn to navigate that gray zone, because survival alone wasn't enough. Resistance required strategy. One afternoon, Jamal returned to the library and found a note slipped under the door. "Trust cautiously. Not everyone wears their true face." He recognized the handwriting. It was Claire's, warning him after an incident where another student pretended to support him but leaked details to Mrs. Carrington. Jamal folded the note and placed it in his notebook. Every act of betrayal reinforced the lesson. Only careful observation, patience, and planning would allow him to survive and fight back. He couldn't afford naivete. By the end of the week, he had mapped allies, enemies, and the gray zone of uncertain loyalties. Every interaction became a test. Every smile or nod from a peer required scrutiny. He realized that social survival was as demanding as academic survival, perhaps even more so. That evening, Jamal practiced speaking up. He rehearsed responses for microaggressions, practiced holding eye contact, and rehearsed quiet comebacks that revealed injustice without provoking retaliation. His bedroom, filled with textbooks and notebooks, became a training ground. "You can't fix everything in one day," he whispered to himself. "But you can prepare for tomorrow." Preparation mattered. Observation mattered. Resistance mattered. And trust. Trust had to be earned, weighed, and guarded. Jamal understood that betrayal was inevitable, but so were small victories, small acts of defiance that made the system blink, even for a moment. By Friday, he felt a mixture of exhaustion and determination. His chest ached from holding back words, from watching others take credit for his labor, from navigating the treacherous social landscape. But amid the betrayals, the small allies, Claire, Miss Harper, even the hesitant nod from Marcus, offered a glimmer of hope. Survival, he realized, wasn't enough. To endure, he had to resist. And resistance required allies, sharp eyes, and a courage he would have to cultivate every single day. The morning started like any other, gray clouds pressing down on the campus. Jamal moved through the halls with measured steps, backpack snug, notebook clutched against his chest. He had learned to anticipate whispers, sidelong glances, the small but precise acts designed to remind him he didn't belong. History class was the first test of the day. Mrs. Carrington's eyes scanned the room like a predator choosing its prey. Jamal felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Every word, every gesture, every glance carried weight. And today, she was determined to remind him of his place. "Jamal," she called, sharp and cold. "You clearly didn't complete the reading last night. Explain why." "I did," he said, keeping his tone calm, steady. "I summarized the chapters and noted key events, just as instructed." The class murmured. Some students smirked, others looked away. Mrs. Carrington's lips pressed into a thin line. "Perhaps you should show us your work," she said, leaning over his desk. Jamal pulled out his notebook, flipping to the pages carefully organized with notes, summaries, and dates. She skimmed them, her eyes flicking up at him with a flash of irritation. She said slowly, her voice laced with mock consideration. "Interesting, but it seems your interpretation is imaginative. Perhaps a bit too imaginative for our standards." He blinked. "I followed the instructions exactly. Every chapter summarized, Key points noted, examples cited. Her laugh was low, almost a snicker. Imaginative. That's one way to put it. The class erupted into quiet giggles, a few students pointing at him. Jamal felt his face heat, but he forced himself to stay seated, silent. Silence was power sometimes. But the breaking point came during the group discussion. A white student deliberately misrepresented one of Jamal's points, twisting it into something ridiculous. Mrs. Carrington nodded, approving the distortion. "You see, Jamal's argument," she began, voice dripping with condescension, "proves how difficult it is for some students to grasp the nuances of history." A hush fell across the room. Jamal's hands tightened into fists beneath the desk. His notes and careful study dismissed as evidence of incompetence. The humiliation was public, precise, surgical. He wanted to speak, to demand correction, but he remembered the subtle rules: patience, documentation, resistance without reckless exposure. So he stayed silent, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the notebook. The bell finally rang, a reprieve that did little to calm the storm inside him. As he left the classroom, a sticky note fluttered from the back of his notebook. "Next time we won't let you explain yourself." The words pierced deeper than anything Mrs. Carrington had said. Someone was watching, orchestrating, maintaining control not through direct confrontation but by intimidation and fear. In the cafeteria, Jamal sat alone, picking at his food, mind racing. Claire appeared, sliding into the seat across from him. Her eyes were wide, anxious. "That was brutal," she said softly. "I didn't know she could humiliate someone like that in front of everyone." Jamal's gaze dropped to his tray. "It's not just her," he said quietly. "It's the system. Everyone sees it and does nothing. That's what hurts the most." He recounted the incident carefully, like reviewing evidence. Claire nodded, listening intently, her hands folded over her notebook. "You're going to have to stand up, Jamal," she said firmly. "Not just for yourself, but so they can't do this to anyone else. You've got the notes, the documentation. You can fight back." He wanted to agree, wanted to feel hope, but a heavier reality settled in. Resistance came with cost. The emotional toll was building, every day a new slight, every interaction a test of endurance. Even small victories were tempered by the awareness that the next attack could be worse. Later he walked through the hallways, every whisper, every glance amplified. Students mocked under their breath, teachers avoided eye contact, and even those who occasionally offered encouragement, Marcus, Claire, Miss Harper, couldn't shield him from every blow. By Thursday he felt it, the fatigue of constant vigilance. His notebooks, once a comfort, now felt like chains, reminders of every injustice endured, every betrayal observed. The weight of resistance pressed down on his shoulders, a storm that refused to break. That evening at home, he collapsed on his bed. His mother watched silently, reading the exhaustion and fear in his eyes. "You can't carry it all by yourself," she said softly. "Even the strongest people need help." "I know," he whispered. "But it's not just about me. It's about making them see. If I don't stand, they keep winning. And the next person, the next student, they won't have a chance." The realization hit him. Survival was one thing, resistance another. And the cost of resistance might be higher than he imagined. But he also knew he couldn't retreat. Not now, not ever. That night, Jamal stayed up late, reviewing his notes, mapping incidents, planning his next steps. Each act of observation, each record of injustice, was a weapon in its own right. Silence would not protect him. Passivity would not save him. Only strategy, courage, and persistence could ensure that the patterns of prejudice could be challenged. By Friday, the breaking point was unmistakable. A confrontation with authority, a betrayal, a public humiliation. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a deliberate system designed to test, to intimidate, and to control. And Jamal realized the fight ahead wouldn't be easy. But he was ready, in his own way, to step into it. Tomorrow he would gather evidence, plan his response, and confront the system. not with anger alone, but with the careful, deliberate power of someone who had learned its patterns and weaknesses. The weekend offered no respite. Jamal spent Saturday at his desk, flipping through his notebooks, reviewing each page with meticulous care. Every insult, every whisper, every dismissal had been recorded. Dates, times, participants. He categorized each incident: verbal microaggressions, public humiliations, acts of favoritism, and blatant acts of bias. The pattern was undeniable. He set up a system. Each teacher had a folder, each student a subfolder. Sticky notes flagged moments that were subtle but significant. Small recordings captured tones, pauses, laughter. Evidence could be denied if it was just words. Documentation made it impossible to ignore. On Sunday he met Claire in the library. The air smelled faintly of old paper and furniture polish. They spread out his notebooks and notes across a long oak table. "Look here," Jamal said, pointing to a set of incidents in history class. "Every single time, she dismisses me and validates a white student's work over mine. Every single time." Claire's eyes widened. It's concrete. If you present this correctly, they can't just brush it off." Jamal nodded. "But it has to be done carefully. One wrong step and it backfires. I need witnesses. I need the exact wording, the tone, the context. Every minor detail counts." They spent hours cross-referencing notes, comparing incidents, and highlighting patterns. Each revelation tightened the knot in Jamal's chest. The school wasn't just a place of learning. It was an intricate network of systemic bias. The following Monday, Jamal approached Miss Harper quietly after her shift. "I need advice," he said, voice low. "I want to make sure the evidence is airtight." Miss Harper examined his notebooks. Her brow furrowed, but her expression softened. "You've done your homework," she said. "You're methodical, organized, precise. That's how this system will be challenged. Not by anger, not by shouting, but by undeniable facts." She handed him a small recorder. "Document interactions carefully. It's legal, but make sure it's discreet. Context matters more than volume." Armed with her guidance, Jamal returned to school with renewed purpose. He noticed details he had previously ignored. The way a teacher's eyes lingered when dismissing him, the exact phrasing used to undermine his answers, the laughter of students who mirrored authority without consequence. Every moment became a data point. By Wednesday, he had compiled enough to see a clear narrative. Patterns of prejudice and abuse of power, consistent across multiple teachers and classes. But Jamal's notebook alone wouldn't be enough. He needed witnesses, peers who could corroborate incidents. He started cautiously, asking Claire and a few other trusted students to jot down what they saw. Most were hesitant, fearful of repercussions. One student refused outright. "You'll get us all in trouble," they whispered, eyes wide. Jamal understood. Fear was part of the system. It wasn't enough to document actions. He had to show how fear itself enforced conformity and silence. Thursday arrived with a stormy sky, matching the tension in Jamal's chest. In history class, Mrs. Carrington launched another subtle attack. A student whispered something under their breath. Jamal, prepared, discreetly recorded the conversation. The tone, the words, the body language, all captured. He knew the recording alone might not win, but combined with the written documentation and witness statements, it would become undeniable. After class, he approached Miss Harper. "I think I've captured the key incidents," he said, showing her the recorder and notebook. She nodded. "You're ready. But remember, emotional composure matters. Present calmly. Let the evidence speak. Never let anger dictate your words." The weight of responsibility pressed on him. He wasn't just gathering evidence for himself. He was preparing to confront a system that had been normalized by years of neglect and complicity. Every recording, every note, every witness testimony had to survive scrutiny. By Friday, Jamal felt a mixture of exhaustion and determination. He had spent days compiling, analyzing, and rehearsing. Each step revealed a clearer picture. Mrs. Carrington's deliberate bias, the subtle complicity of other staff, the culture of silence that allowed abuse to continue unchecked. That night, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. A strange mix of fear and resolve filled him. He thought of the civil rights leaders he had read about, the people who had fought systems far bigger than themselves. He drew strength from that legacy, realizing that courage was not the absence of fear. It was acting despite it. Jamal's plan crystallized. He would confront the administration with his evidence. Written records, recordings, witness statements. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Institutions rarely admit fault willingly. But the data was clear, the pattern undeniable, and he had prepared for scrutiny and pushback. In his heart he knew the risk. Retaliation was possible. Humiliation could escalate. Teachers could dismiss him, students could turn, administrators could ignore. But passivity was no longer an option. By Sunday evening, Jamal reviewed his plan one last time. Evidence organized, allies informed, strategy rehearsed. Every word, every tone, every angle had been anticipated. Tomorrow he would step into the administration office, not with anger, but with precision. For the first time he felt a strange sense of calm. The breaking point had passed. Now came the challenge. Turning observation into action, documentation into accountability. The storm was coming, and Jamal was ready. Monday morning arrived with a heavy sky, the kind of gray that presses down on shoulders and tempers resolve. Jamal's notebook and recorder were tucked into his backpack, each page a small weapon in his arsenal. He walked into the school with measured steps, aware that today would test everything he had prepared. History class passed like a blur. Mrs. Carrington was as sharp as ever, her gaze slicing across the room, but Jamal stayed calm, responding when called upon with precision, his tone measured. He kept his eyes on the notebook, mentally rehearsing what he would say, the evidence he would present. When the final bell rang, signaling the end of class, he didn't head to his locker. Instead, he went straight to the principal's office. Each step felt deliberate, echoing in the quiet hallway. The office door was closed. Jamal knocked lightly. "Come in," a voice called. He entered, the room warm, the air filled with the faint scent of coffee and paper. Principal Reynolds sat behind a polished oak desk, eyes scanning a tablet. "Jamal, what brings you here?" Jamal swallowed, steadying himself. "I have evidence I'd like to present. It concerns discriminatory behavior in the school," he said calmly, placing the notebook and recorder on the desk. Reynolds' eyebrows lifted slightly, but his tone remained neutral. "Go on." Jamal began systematically, detailing incidents from history class, chemistry, and beyond. He presented his notes chronologically, highlighting patterns, quoting dialogue, and including names of witnesses. The recorder captured tones, pauses, laughter, subtle but clear evidence of bias. As he spoke, Principal Reynolds listened quietly, occasionally nodding. Jamal's voice remained even, careful to convey the facts, the patterns, and the emotional impact without letting anger dictate his words. "This isn't about personal disagreements," Jamal said, placing emphasis on the systemic nature of the incidents. "It's about a pattern of discriminatory treatment that affects not only me but other students who may be afraid to speak." Reynolds leaned back, folding his hands. "This is serious," he said. "Do you have corroborating statements?" "Yes," Jamal replied, sliding a folder across the desk. Inside were notes from Claire, Miss Harper, and a few other students who had agreed to testify if needed. Each event is documented with witnesses and, where possible, recordings. The principal's eyes lingered on the materials. "And your goal is, what exactly?" "To ensure the school addresses this behavior," Jamal said firmly. "Not to punish anyone personally, but to create accountability. If the patterns are left unchecked, they continue. That's what this is about." Reynolds' expression softened slightly. "I appreciate your diligence and courage," he said. This will be investigated thoroughly. I'll need to speak with the teachers involved, and possibly other staff and students. Are you prepared for that? Jamal nodded. I am. Inside, though, his heart raced. Confrontation was one thing. Navigating the bureaucracy, ensuring the evidence wasn't dismissed, was another. Every step had to be calculated. Over the next 2 weeks, meetings were scheduled. Jamal presented his evidence multiple times, each session tense. Mrs. Carrington maintained her calm facade, denying bias, deflecting responsibility, but the recorded interactions and written notes left little room for dismissal. Other teachers, when confronted, either remained silent or acknowledged small oversights, but the pattern was undeniable. Some students who had been hesitant at first now provided witness accounts, their courage bolstered by Jamal's meticulous preparation. Claire sat beside him in several meetings, offering silent support, a constant reminder that allies mattered. Despite progress, the emotional toll weighed heavily. Every interaction with staff or students who tried to minimize his experiences left him drained. Sleep became difficult, meals routine, but joy scarce. Resistance carried cost, not just effort, but constant vigilance and emotional endurance. Finally, after one particularly intense meeting, Principal Reynolds leaned back, exhaling slowly. Jamal, the evidence is compelling, he said. We cannot ignore this. There will be consequences, and measures will be put in place to prevent future occurrences. Relief washed over Jamal, but it was tempered by exhaustion. Victory had been earned through careful planning, documentation, and endurance, not through anger, shouting, or impulsive confrontation. When he left the office, the hallway seemed brighter, though the winter sky remained gray. He knew this was only the beginning. Systemic change required more than one confrontation, more than one investigation. But he had proven something essential, that measured resistance, preparation, and courage could challenge even entrenched power. That afternoon, he returned to the library, notebook in hand, and found Miss Harper. She smiled faintly. You did it, she said simply. I knew you would. Jamal allowed himself a small smile. It's not over, he said quietly. But it's a start. And that start, it matters. Outside, the wind rustled leaves along the pathways. Jamal walked through the campus, feeling the weight of what had been accomplished, and the knowledge of the work that remained. The confrontation had been exhausting but essential. Each act of courage, each piece of evidence, had chipped away at the wall of denial and indifference. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope, not just for himself, but for anyone else who might face similar prejudice. The school, the system, the patterns, they weren't invincible. They could be challenged. And Jamal knew, in the quiet moments walking through empty hallways, that he had found a strength within himself he hadn't realized existed. The following week felt surreal. Jamal walked through the halls with a sense of cautious vigilance. The confrontation with Principal Reynolds had gone as well as he could have hoped. Bureaucratic processes were slow, but the evidence was undeniable. Yet he knew that exposure wasn't just about presenting facts. It was about visibility, about making the community understand that systemic injustice had persisted unchecked for far too long. By Tuesday morning, news of the investigation had quietly begun to ripple through the school. Whispers followed him down the hallways. Curious, speculative, some supportive, others hostile. Jamal ignored the glances, keeping his focus on the task ahead. The school needed to acknowledge what had been happening, and that required patience as much as courage. In history class, Mrs. Carrington's usual sharpness seemed tempered, but her eyes still carried subtle venom. Jamal noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way she corrected herself mid-sentence when speaking to the class, cautious not to provoke further scrutiny. Students who had once laughed at his misfortune now avoided her gaze, sensing the shift. Small cracks in authority were appearing. By Thursday, the local newspaper had caught wind of the situation. A reporter from the community education section contacted Principal Reynolds, requesting comments on a possible story about discrimination within the school. Jamal had not sought media attention. He had been focused on documentation, but now the exposure was growing beyond his control. In the cafeteria, students whispered and speculated openly. Some offered quiet words of encouragement, others mocked the drama of the investigation. Jamal stayed at his table, notebook in hand, recording the reactions, cataloging who spoke and who remained silent. Even the cafeteria's noisy chaos became part of the evidence, demonstrating the school climate and its impact on student behavior. Later, during a school assembly, Principal Reynolds addressed the student body. "We are currently reviewing concerns raised about classroom behavior," he said, voice measured. "We take these issues seriously. We will continue to work to ensure fairness and accountability." Applause echoed unevenly, tentative in parts, hesitant in others. Jamal felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. Change was beginning, but the fight was far from over. For the first time, however, the patterns he had so meticulously documented were being acknowledged publicly. That afternoon, Jamal met Claire and Miss Harper in the library. Claire's hands shook slightly as she held a printed article from the local newspaper. "It's out," she whispered. "People are talking." The article recounted Jamal's documentation, carefully worded, emphasizing systemic bias and the school's plan to address the reported behavior. It didn't sensationalize his struggle. It framed it as a matter of fairness and accountability. Jamal read it silently, his heart pounding. For the first time, the story of his daily battles, his careful resistance, was visible beyond the walls of the school. Miss Harper put a hand on his shoulder. "You've done more than survive," she said. "You've shown them what it means to hold power accountable. That takes courage and precision." Even as exposure grew, Jamal remained cautious. Some teachers, aware of the investigation, tried to subtly intimidate him, while others offered quiet support. The social climate shifted. Students began to talk openly, some in support, some in fear of being implicated. The invisible patterns he had mapped for months were now visible to the wider community. By Friday, school administrators began formal interviews with staff and students who had witnessed incidents. Jamal answered questions honestly, calmly, presenting evidence without anger, relying on the meticulous documentation he had compiled. Every notebook entry, every recorded conversation, every witness statement added weight to the narrative. The school had failed to protect him, and systemic bias had persisted through silence and complicity. Outside school, Jamal felt the emotional weight of exposure. Each step forward in public scrutiny was exhausting. He had endured ridicule, microaggressions, betrayal, and fear, and now the stakes had grown even higher. But he also recognized the significance of what he had accomplished. Visibility, documentation, and strategic confrontation were creating pressure that could no longer be ignored. At home that evening, Jamal's mother embraced him. "You've done something incredible," she said softly. "You've turned a system against itself, and you've done it without losing yourself." Jamal nodded, feeling a combination of pride and fatigue. The exposure wasn't just about Mrs. Carrington or individual acts of bias. It was about shining light on patterns that had been allowed to persist for too long. Justice, he realized, required patience, courage, and meticulous attention to detail. The weekend brought a mix of emotions. Students who had previously ignored him now approached him quietly, offering apologies, sharing stories, or simply nodding in recognition of his bravery. Some remained hostile, refusing to acknowledge the systemic failures, but even their resistance was now visible. By Monday, the first steps toward accountability began to manifest. Mrs. Carrington was called in for formal review and temporary suspension pending investigation. Other staff members who had enabled or ignored bias faced questioning. Jamal observed the shifts quietly, noting the interplay of authority, denial, and eventual acknowledgement. As he walked through the campus, notebook in hand, he realized the impact of exposure. Patterns that had been invisible to most were now being acknowledged. The system, while slow, was being forced to confront itself. Jamal's careful observation, documentation, and strategic action had created change. Not instantaneous, not complete but undeniable. He felt a sense of cautious optimism. Exposure had opened the door to accountability, making the school confront the very behaviors that had sought to suppress him. The fight had been long, painful, and exhausting, but it was working. And yet, Jamal knew the personal cost of exposure. The stress, the fear, the isolation, the emotional toll. Change required courage, but it demanded resilience. The battle was far from over, but the first victory, the acknowledgement of systemic injustice, was a foundation he could build on. The week after exposure felt surreal, a mixture of tension, relief, and quiet triumph. Jamal walked through the school halls with cautious pride. The environment was still tense, but the weight of silence had lifted. His careful documentation, the recordings, and the witness testimonies had forced the school administration to confront the reality of systemic bias. Now, the consequences were beginning to unfold. Mrs. Carrington's suspension was the first visible result. Jamal heard whispers from students and teachers alike, some supportive, some bitter. It was poetic justice in its simplest form. The teacher who had wielded authority to humiliate and suppress now faced accountability. But Jamal knew justice was never purely satisfying. It came with complexity and cost. In the cafeteria, Marcus approached cautiously. "Hey," he said quietly, sliding into the seat across from Jamal. I just wanted to say, see you. Get it now. You didn't just survive. You made them pay attention." Jamal allowed a faint smile. Allies were crucial, but recognition wasn't the reward. Change was. The subtle shifts across the school were the victory. Teachers who had ignored bias were being questioned. Students who had laughed or stayed silent were forced to confront their own complicity. Jamal's actions had created ripple effects. By Wednesday, the results were undeniable. The school board held a formal meeting to discuss policy changes and disciplinary actions. Jamal's evidence was presented in front of administrators, parents, and faculty. Each slide, each recording, each written note reinforced the narrative. Systemic prejudice had been ignored for too long, and the consequences were now unavoidable. Mrs. Carrington remained silent during the presentation, her usual sharpness replaced by a mask of discomfort. The recordings played in the background, capturing tone, laughter, and dismissive language, details that could not be argued away. Even her supporters within the staff were forced to acknowledge the pattern. Jamal watched from the front row, heart pounding. He felt the weight of months of observation, endurance, and meticulous documentation. This was the culmination of all the late nights, careful recordings, and strategic patience. And yet, there was no celebration. Justice was measured, procedural, and exacting. Not a dramatic victory but a recognition of wrongdoing and a commitment to change. Outside the board meeting, students approached him cautiously, offering quiet congratulations. Some apologized for their past behavior. Others admitted that they had been too afraid to speak up themselves. Even small gestures mattered. They were the human evidence of systemic awareness shifting toward accountability. At home, Jamal shared the outcome with his mother. "They're taking action," he said quietly. "Not just with Mrs. Carrington, but policies are being rewritten. Teachers are being retrained. Bias can't hide anymore." She smiled, relief and pride mixing in her eyes. "You've changed more than one person," she said. "You've changed a system." The poetic justice extended beyond disciplinary measures. Mrs. Carrington, previously untouchable, was now under scrutiny. Her credibility diminished. Other staff members who had ignored her actions were receiving counseling and supervision. The system, which had allowed bias to flourish unchecked, was being forced to confront itself. Yet Jamal felt the emotional cost acutely. The months of isolation, subtle humiliation, and constant vigilance had left their mark. Sleep was still uneven, meals hurried, and anxiety lingered in quiet moments. Poetic justice didn't erase trauma. It acknowledged wrongdoing, corrected behavior, and imposed consequences, but it couldn't fully repair the scars left by systemic oppression. One afternoon, as Jamal walked through the nearly empty halls, He noticed Mrs. Carrington packing her classroom. There was no anger in him, just observation. Authority could wield power, but accountability had caught up. The balance had shifted, and even she could not ignore it. In the library, Claire and Miss Harper met him with quiet smiles. "You did it," Claire said softly. "You held the system accountable without losing yourself in the fight." "It wasn't just me," Jamal replied. "It was documentation, strategy, patience, and allies." Change required more than anger. It required persistence. Miss Harper nodded. "And courage. Many students would have crumbled under what you endured. You turned adversity into action. That's the real justice." By the end of the week, Jamal felt a cautious sense of resolution. The school had been forced to acknowledge the patterns he had observed for months. Policies were being rewritten, teachers retrained, and students educated about bias and accountability. Poetic justice had been served, not as revenge, but as correction, visibility, and consequence. Walking home through the autumn-colored streets, Jamal reflected on the journey. Survival had been the first step, learning to navigate bias, microaggressions, and betrayal. Resistance had been the next, careful, calculated, and strategic. And exposure had made systemic injustice undeniable. Now, poetic justice ensured accountability and set the stage for future protection of students. He understood that the fight wasn't entirely over. Systems evolve slowly, and vigilance was always necessary. But for the first time, he felt a quiet confidence. His voice mattered, his documentation mattered, and his courage had forced a system to confront itself. The wind rustled the fallen leaves along the sidewalk, carrying a sense of change. Jamal walked with measured steps, head held high. Poetic justice had been delivered, and while the scars of struggle remained, the landscape had shifted. Change, deliberate and persistent, had begun, and Jamal knew that even in the quiet aftermath, his actions would echo, shaping not just his future, but the environment for those who came after him. The weeks after Mrs. Carrington's suspension and the formal investigations felt surreal. The hallways were quieter, not in the oppressive way they had been before, but with a cautious optimism. Students no longer whispered to belittle. Some whispered to acknowledge, to offer support, or even to apologize. Jamal noticed subtle shifts in behavior, in tone, and in the way authority figures walked the halls. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress. Jamal sat in the library one afternoon, notebook open, but not for documentation this time. He was reflecting, allowing himself a moment to process months of tension, humiliation, strategy, and resilience. The weight that had pressed so heavily on his shoulders had eased, replaced with a sense of quiet strength. Every page in his notebook told a story, not just of bias and oppression, but of his endurance and courage. Claire approached, smiling. "You've changed the school," she said softly. "People are noticing. Teachers are careful, policies are being followed, and students, they're listening." Jamal nodded. "It's a start. Change takes time. But it's happening." The exposure had created accountability, and the poetic justice that followed had been firm but fair. Mrs. Carrington's suspension, the formal reviews of other staff, and the introduction of anti-bias policies were visible signs that the system was beginning to correct itself. But Jamal knew that the scars of injustice couldn't be erased overnight. He had felt the weight of fear, isolation, and betrayal, and those experiences lingered. He thought back to moments of despair, the lab reports stolen by Dylan, the classroom humiliations, the subtle dismissals, the whispers, and the sticky notes. Each one had tested him, each one had forced him to develop endurance and strategy. Reflection now revealed that these trials had shaped him in ways he hadn't anticipated. They had taught him patience, observation, and the power of meticulous planning. Walking through the halls, he saw small signs of progress. Teachers acknowledged students' contributions more carefully. Students hesitated before mocking or whispering. Allies, once hesitant and silent, now stepped forward with quiet confidence. Jamal realized that change didn't always come with fanfare. It often came quietly, through the shifting behavior of a community forced to confront itself. At home, Jamal shared his reflections with his mother. "It's been hard," he admitted, "but I think I've learned something important. Change isn't about anger. It's about being prepared, being patient, and knowing your value. If you wait for someone else to notice, nothing changes. You have to show it. Every day, carefully, persistently." She smiled, her eyes misty. "You've done more than survive, Jamal. You've shown resilience, courage, and integrity. That's something no one can take away from you." School life continued with subtle but meaningful transformation. Anti-bias training sessions were implemented for teachers, and students were educated on how to recognize and challenge systemic discrimination. Jamal observed these sessions quietly, noting the tentative but growing awareness. Policies were no longer abstract. They were actively shaping behavior, holding individuals accountable, and creating a safer environment for those who might have once felt invisible. One afternoon, as he walked past the history classroom, Jamal saw a new substitute teacher writing on the board. She smiled at him and acknowledged his raised hand without hesitation, the first time someone had offered that simple gesture without judgment. The moment was small, almost ordinary, but it carried immense symbolic weight. Recognition, respect, and fairness were becoming normalized, slowly eroding the patterns that had once isolated him. Jamal reflected on the journey. Survival had been the first phase, learning to navigate bias and microaggressions. Resistance had followed, calculated, careful, strategic. Exposure had amplified the truth, forcing accountability and visibility. And poetic justice had reshaped authority, establishing consequences for those who had abused their power. Each step had required courage, resilience, and clarity. He understood that change was ongoing. Systems evolve, and vigilance was still required. But he also recognized the power of his actions. His careful documentation, his calm confrontation, his strategic planning, and his courage had created ripples that extended beyond his own experiences. The school's environment, once hostile and oppressive, was beginning to reflect accountability, awareness, and fairness. Jamal's notebook, once a tool of survival, had transformed into a symbol of empowerment. Every observation, every recorded conversation, every note on a whisper or glance, had become part of a story larger than his own, a story of endurance, justice, and moral courage. In the quiet of the library, Jamal closed his notebook and looked out the window. The sunlight broke through the clouds, falling across the campus. It wasn't perfect. Prejudice and bias would always exist, but the environment had shifted, and for the first time he felt truly seen, heard, and respected. He knew the lessons he had learned would stay with him. The importance of preparation, the value of allies, the necessity of courage, and the enduring power of truth. These lessons would guide him beyond high school, into a world where systemic bias persisted, and where change required action as deliberate and careful as the months he had spent documenting and resisting injustice. As he packed his bag and left the library, Jamal walked with measured confidence. The journey had been arduous, filled with trials and betrayal, but reflection revealed its worth. He had survived, he had resisted, he had exposed injustice, and he had witnessed accountability. In that, he found resolution not only for himself but for the community around him. The wind stirred the autumn leaves along the campus walkways, carrying the faint scent of change. Jamal inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the past months lift slightly. Reflection had revealed clarity, and resolution had brought a sense of purpose. He had faced bias, betrayal, and systemic injustice, and through careful, courageous action, he had reshaped the landscape.